Hey, just a heads up that the following content may be disturbing or triggering for some listeners and is not appropriate for children. Please take care of yourself and others who may be listening with you. Welcome to the Bonus Babies Podcast, a show that has no easy answers, only hard questions.
I found that when parents learn that their children do everything they do to try to meet a need, even if their strategy to meet it is a tragic expression of an unmet need. I remember a mother sitting with an 8-year-old daughter, adopted from an early age, and the mother was very distressed because the daughter kept hoarding sweets in her bedroom. And she'd find the next morning, no matter how many times she had scolded the daughter, there would be some wrappers of things left. And I looked at the daughter, and while I was saying this to the daughter, I was really saying it to mom at least as much. I said, so you lived for a long time without any sweetness in your life, and you want to make sure you never run out of sweetness. And I noticed the mother's tears are streaming down her cheeks. It's a whole new way of thinking about what's under the behavior. This daughter was trying to meet a real need to not run out of sweetness. It was a bit of a metaphor, but to not run out of sweetness. And her strategy, not good for the teeth, maybe good for business, for dentists, but not good for her teeth. And the mother knew that and understood that, but she didn't know what was underneath the behavior. And so a lot of what I do is working and teaching parents to develop a needs consciousness. I send them a needs list, and I probably should start sending them a strategies list too, because the strategies we have for meeting our needs are absolutely hysterical and tragic at the same time.
Can you tell me what you call the kids who you've cared for over the years?
We feel that the children that we receive coming into our home are bonuses. So we call them bonus babies.
I love that. This is your host, Jayne Amelia Larson, and I'm a CASA, a court-appointed special advocate volunteer for youth in foster care. Yeah, I know it's a mouthful. In the same way a CASA works, I explore all things in the foster care maze by talking to kids, parents, caregivers, attorneys, social workers, therapists, really anybody and everybody who will speak to me to keep the conversation open and the information flowing about all things CASA.
Hi, this is Jake Everly, the producer of the Bonus Babies podcast. And today, Jayne Amelia speaks with Dr. Bruce Sogolow. Dr. Sogolow had a couple of master's degrees, and he was pretty happy doing couples therapy, and then decided he wanted to get his doctorate. And when he was trying to figure out what he was going to do for his doctorate thesis, he had a conversation with one of his teachers, and she asked him about attachment theory. At the time, he wasn't sure what that was, but one thing led to another, and that became his career for about 30 years. Also, I want to add we had some technical difficulties on our first couple of attempts with Dr. Sogolow, so at the end of this episode, I parsed together a few valuable comments that he'd made that didn't make it into this particular recording. Here's Dr. Bruce Sogolow.
Okay, I'm here with Dr. Bruce Sogolow. We are here again. We're trying again. We had some tech issues. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. I'm hoping it works this time.
And you sound good. So I think this is going to work. Fingers crossed. Okay. The obvious question. I've asked it before, but I want to hear it again. Why do you pronounce your name Sogolow? Wait a minute. How do you say it? I said it the way the kids say it.
I say it's Sogolow, the way my grandparents did.
Right. Sogolow.
My
and your
kids
say
say
Sogolow.
And I have two guesses. They're only my hypotheses. I need to ask them. One guess is that it's because they got tired of people saying, how do you spell that? So saying Sogolow, makes it clearer. The other guess is that they are both musicians, and they may just hear things differently than everybody else. They really do. I mean, one of my sons is a master guitarist, and when he would be watching a commercial on TV, he'd have the guitar in his lap, and he'd start playing the music that they were playing in the background immediately. So that's a level of hearing that I don't have. So
Yeah, I'm jealous of that. I don't have that. I have the interest, but not the talent. Yeah.
Yeah. So Sogolow is how I say it, and that's the way it was said in my hometown, my parents, grandparents, the people I knew. So, and every now and then someone would see it because it's spelled like the three little words, so, go, low. Someone would put an F where the W was and call me Sogolow. That still happens once in a while. And I think they're trying to, use a Russian pronunciation. My grandparents came to the United States from Belarus, and my grandmother actually mostly walked from Belarus across Siberia to get to a tramp steamer to get to Japan and then to the United States, and then she took a train. I mean, it's just these stories are
Wow, can
amazing.
you imagine that kind of journey that people did that?
It's
Wow.
just, as a kid, I took it for granted when I, little. Grandma came across the country from Belarus, but as an adult, I kind of put myself in her shoes, and I think she was 15, by the way. So,
15 when she did that.
yeah,
Wow.
amazing.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about how you're raised, because this is an interesting story too. Please go ahead.
Okay, well, I was raised in New England in a old factory town where most of the business was going south because there were better tax breaks for the companies. But in the meantime, it was a mostly textile manufacturing town. And my parents and grandparents were all Jewish. And so I was raised in a Jewish family, which meant that I went to Hebrew school 2 days a week after public school. And I look back with some regret. We really gave our poor Hebrew school teachers a run for their money. A bunch of little kids bursting at the seams after being in school all day, and then I was bar mitzvahed, and I actually didn't know. I thought maybe I missed something because I didn't have any spiritual awakening at 13. So I went for 2 more years. A bunch of us went from being bar mitzvahed and bat mitzvahed to studying with a rabbi once a week in his offices and going into more detail and depth about the Bible. And while I don't regret it, it still didn't bring me the awakening I was looking for, or the connection, I guess would probably be a better way. To my parents' credit, they had many friends who were not Jewish, as well as friends who were Jewish. And so it wasn't a thing. Being Jewish wasn't a kind of a thing to take pride in a toxic way. I was proud of my heritage, but not in the sense of we're better than. It wasn't a chauvinistic thing.
hmm And your parents were very aware of the contributions that they could make for the community on whatever level, right?
That
Tell me about
that
that.
was such a part of our family culture. I'm so grateful for that. It was invisible to me in some ways, but my mother and father were both deeply involved in supporting and working with families where at least one member had cerebral palsy. So that was a commitment that they had. My father had a very small moving company. People picture big trucks going across the country, but he had two small trucks, and he did a lot of in-town picking up freight and moving it to another factory where the next process was going to happen. And on Sundays, for as long as I can remember, he volunteered his Sundays to move people for free who couldn't afford to move. And he had a small
Wow.
crew, and he would take care of them, which maybe meant feeding them and paying them a little bit. And it was just part of who he was, and that was part of how I understood being a human, was that you look after people and you give what you can.
hmm but you didn't spend all your teenage years at home with your parents. What happened?
No, unfortunately, like many people growing up in the late 60s, there was a lot of controversy around political ideas between my father and me. And Vietnam War was raging, and I was raging against it. And as an idealistic 16-year-old, it was pretty hard for my father to be around that and hear it. So there could only be one alpha male in the family, and so I ended up moving. Wonder, it was a great gift to me that my mother called one night. I remember watching her call my grandmother, her mother, and asking grandma would she be okay having a boarder come to live with her. And the time it took for my grandmother, apparently on the other end of the line, to say yes from the time the question was asked was almost instantaneous. And the next day, I was living in Springfield, Massachusetts with my grandmother, who's 52 years older than me. And she really, in a lot of ways, saved my life. There's a song that says, "You gave me love when nobody gave me a prayer." Well, that's what my grandmother did. So we had a great connection with each other. I finished high school miraculously. And I guess I'd like to tell you one thing that happened right after I finished high school because I think it's relevant to where my journey went subsequently. I was wondering what to do. I was in my bedroom thinking about things and wondering right after high school graduation what to do with my life. And I kept thinking I don't want to have 2.3 children and a dog and a picket fence and get a gold watch at the end of my career. And so I was just trying to think of what is worth living for. And I made a decision. I decided that I was going to dedicate my life to loving each person that I met as I encountered them, which ended up being a guiding principle in my life. I had no idea the journey I was in for once I made that decision.
So hang on a second. So you were thinking this when you were
18,
a very young
just turned
man. Yeah.
18.
How did you come to that? I mean, it's pretty lofty for an 18-year-old.
Looking back, it sounds like that, but in terms of my actual experience, I was very interested in literature and poetry and the world of ideas. And I remember thinking about what Thoreau said that and back then he said most men, but I would think most people live lives of quiet desperation. And then there was a song by the group The Doors, which said, "All our lives we sweat and slave, building for a shallow grave. Must be something else to say, something to defend this place." And those things really hit me hard. And I thought, what would make life worth living? And intuitively, I'm sure through a lot of different influences in my life, intuitively, I ended up with loving people, loving each person. And I really started out seeking to do that in each encounter I had with each person, whether it was a cashier at a grocery store or whether it was somebody that treated me poorly or treated me well. And what a learning experience it was. And a humbling experience, I should add.
I would imagine because I'm sure you're not always successful, but
I was so unsuccessful.
even if you try, right?
Yeah, I gave it a good try, and I still am. And at first I was in a crisis mode because not everybody seemed lovable to me. And it was like, oh, I didn't think of that. How do I do that? And so I had to find my way through all sorts of things to get to um, learning how to love and what that actually meant. And it turns out for me, it wasn't a warm, mushy feeling. It was a need more than anything, that the need to love and be loved. And when I started thinking in those terms, I started developing strategies that might help meet those needs.
Right. So tell me about your education and your career because that was an interesting journey too.
Yeah, it was. I would have been voted most likely to fail in high school every year but I used to think I was a terrible high school student or terrible student, but the truth is I wasn't a student. I wasn't studying. I didn't open my books. I didn't read the materials. I didn't do the assignments.
So
Um,
you were just lazy. You're
uh,
saying you're just lazy.
no, I don't think so because I was very motivated to read everything else in the world.
I see. I see. Mm-hmm.
If I were judged on the things I was learning and reading as opposed to the stuff I was being asked to read in school, I think I would have done okay. Um, I think I would have been a better college student than a high school student looking back because I was just curious. I would have liked to have chosen my courses, but I wasn't ready. So part of it wasn't, the material. It was just that I wasn't ready yet. You see, I don't want to cop to the idea of being lazy because I don't think people are lazy. I think we have
Yeah.
moments of laziness for sure, but yeah.
I think that's a very fair thing to say because whenever you put that judgment on, and I'm sorry I did it, but I was kind of teasing.
I know you were.
But when you say you're just being lazy. Well, that's just not fair because usually it has to do with motivation. It has to do with interest,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah. So the same person that looks like they're lazy at work might be the most enthusiastic amateur bowler and show all the motivation in the world. So to think that they're lazy or not motivated, well, maybe around the task at work. But to say somebody is something as a state of being is something that I try very hard not to do in my life, not to even think in my life about me or other people, because, like Walt Whitman said, I think we contain multitudes, and there are many parts to everybody.
I love that optimistic view of people. I find that encouraging. And I guess that's probably been true of you in your work. In spite of the difficulty of your work, and I want to hear about that, you remain committed to a positive outcome.
Yes, although, I've certainly had my moments of discouragement. I don't want to act like it was, smooth sailing. So I finished high school. I took a couple of years to start to live out that. How do you live a life of love? And when I was 22, I went to college for the first time, and I was very fortunate to get into a local state university and went there. And 2.5 years later, I had finished and thought I wanted to be a lawyer when I grew up. So I went to law school for half a year. And then I decided, no, I think there's something else, but I don't know what it is. But the next time I do this, I'm going to really know it's me through and through. And a couple of years later, I went started going to graduate school in psychology, and that really was who I was. I was very interested in humans and what people's stories were since I was really young. So that was a much more natural, and it's turned out to be enduring area of interest in my life.
Right, and you ended up becoming essentially an expert on kids who had trouble adjusting to either families they were placed with or an adoption. So tell me about that. How did you arrive at that?
Okay, so I had a pretty flourishing private practice. I was mostly seeing couples, and I thought, this is what I'm going to do. I really have a knack for working with couples, and I really enjoy it, and they seem to get a lot from it. And that was my thought. And then three things came together really at the same time in a really powerful way. One was that I went back to school for a doctorate, and when I'd finished all my coursework, I asked my advisor, um, how could I study something, do a research project on something that I really wanted to do. And she suggested to me when I explained what I was interested in, she suggested, how about making it about attachment theory? And I didn't know what attachment theory was. I'd had two master's degrees and a doctoral. All the studies were behind me, all the coursework, and I didn't know. So we talked about it, and she gave me about 10 books to read. And I read through them, and I started my very deep dive into learning about what attachment theory is and how attachment works in human beings. And at the same time, I designed the dissertation research project I was going to do, and that included using the input of therapists in the community where I was. And so I had a number of therapists that knew I was deeply interested in attachment, and they started sending me and referring to me to families who had children who either came from the foster system or had ultimately been adopted and were having a terribly difficult time in family life. And so those two things, their referrals, my studying attachment. And then the third thing was a nephew and niece of ours, my wife and I, a nephew and niece of ours fostered and adopted a young boy that we became very involved with. And he was a part of our life increasingly to the point where he ended up living with us. And so we got to see firsthand what it looks like to have someone in your family who sees family as an extremely dangerous thing based on their early history.
Wow, wow, that's so traumatic for a kid. You know what we like to think of our children feeling safe and loved and
Yes.
supported, and so often that's not the case.
Jane, it's all too often. I'm not here to say that most adoptive children are attachment challenged. Many of them do very, very well in their new homes, but a large percentage don't. And it's that percentage of people that I've been working with over the last 20 years. In fact, I've really changed the way I say it from working with families to walking with families. It no longer feels like work to me. It feels like a walk beside them and with them on their journey. And they asked me, given that some of these children have been with them since they were born or since they were 3 years old, coming out of an orphanage, or 1 years old, and parents often ask me, why after all this time do they still have these problems? We thought we would adopt, they would experience maybe 6 months of trying to adjust, and then our constant love and the structure we provided would be enough for them to come through. And here we are, they're 14 and they're still having as tough a time as they were having in the beginning. And so I was thinking about this one night, awake in bed, trying to think of what's an analogy, and I remembered that when I was growing up in the 60s, there would occasionally be an article about some Japanese soldier that was hiding in a cave that didn't know the war was over. So when I got up the next morning, I did a Google search and I started looking and saw that there was actually one soldier, Hiru Onoda, who was a Japanese soldier on a spy mission in the Philippines in the late 30s. And he was living in a cave, and it was 1973. So the war had been over for 28 years, but he was still
My.
fighting the war, thinking that it wasn't over. And suddenly I had an analogy that made sense to me. Our kids were fighting wars that were long over. So,
And they were still living in it, or were going back to it even. Even if they move forward,
yes,
it's very easy to go back and land in in that fissure again, right?
absolutely the reality. So they remind me in a way. I don't know if you've seen the movie Buck, not Uncle Buck.
I love that
the
movie.
it,
I love that
it's
movie. Yeah.
a documentary, but it's a very you're in it. It's really well done about a man who had come from a um, horribly abusive home. Father that used to beat he and his brother to within an inch of their lives, on a nightly basis, and just brutal, very broken man, obviously. And the kids were ultimately removed and ended up in a group home, which was really a ranch. And the story shows this man with horses who have been extremely difficult to control, or to, what the old word was to break. And what he would say was to start. He started horses, he didn't break them. And he shows and explains that these very skittish horses need to be approached in a very gentle, non-threatening way. And so it's a beautiful film, and I think of our kids. I've referred many parents to this film because the film Buck shows how our children are, that the most, they need a different level of parenting than typical parenting. They need the most non-threatening. And of course, a lot of times when I start with that, parents think I'm going to encourage them to be permissive, anything goes. And it's funny how they go to the other extreme in thinking. And what I'm really trying to say is there's a way to develop connection before correction with children. And I learned a lot through Marshall Rosenberg, who developed a thing called nonviolent communication. So I don't want to claim credit for things that came to me as a result of his work. But the idea that connection before correction needs to be established, I think I'd like to tell you a story if it's okay.
Please, yes, yes.
So when we were blessed with our great nephew living with us, it had been a couple months, and I'm hard enough to look after by my wife without another person, having a teenager in our home who was hard to look after. So one day my wife in private said to me, he needs to learn to start fixing up his room or cleaning it up, or and help with the dishes. I mean, I can't be doing all of this for everybody. And I was afraid at the moment she said that she was going to do the equivalent of spooking a horse. She was going to confront him, and it was going to ruin what we were establishing with him. And so instead, I said to her, give me a little bit of time. I'm going to talk to him about this, but I'm going to talk to him about it in a different kind of way. So what I said to him was, I asked him one day when the two of us were sitting actually at the breakfast counter, I said to him, I'd like to ask you to make me a promise if you're willing. And he kind of looked at me and said, okay, uncle. And he said, what's the promise? And I said, I'd like you to promise me that you will never clean up your room or dishes or any of that ever again unless you can do it with the joy of contributing to the family. And that was about it. I said, are you willing to make that commitment? He said, sure. And I thought, we'll see. I wasn't trying to use reverse psychology or anything. I'm not really a big fan of manipulation. And so within 2 weeks, he started cleaning up the dishes, cleaning up his room, and asked if he could asked my wife, who's a really gifted and knowledgeable cook, if he could learn how to cook dinners for us and meals for us. And never again did we have to ask him to clean anything, do anything. It stuck. And so that approach, which sounds kind of bizarre, promise me you won't do this unless you love doing it, basically. It was effective, and it's kind of a representation of so much of the kind of work I do with families.
Right. So why do you think that worked? I mean, obviously you were doing it with love, and you were asking him to make his own choice and to make a choice that made him happy as well.
Yes.
So, what else? Like, why do you think it worked?
I've wondered about that over the years, and I think you've summed it up pretty well in terms of my own thinking. That first of all, the choice was his. People, we really don't like demands. We like our autonomy too much, and so I think that was a big part of it. I think the notion that this could be that there's such a thing as the joy of contribution was a whole new idea to him, as it is in most families. Usually it's these are your chores, and families have what I call chores wars, and they just spend so much time laboring over that. And I think that underlying idea of connection before correction, I was way more focused on being deeply connected with him and him being deeply connected with us, than I was on having this single mindedness of purpose to get him to do something.
Right. But I think also it creates rapport and trust. And once there's trust, there's a generosity of spirit, and that's probably how he felt, that he wanted to be part of the household.
Jayne, you just said it better than I've ever said it. That there, trust is the beginning of everything. I once had a parent really almost literally screaming in my face, "How do I get him to respect me? How do I get him to respect me?" And I had been taught by one of the experts in the field, Daniel Hughes, that if you can get a child to trust you, the respect will follow. And a lot of things follow. So that, yeah, he really came alive, enjoying so much that contribution.
So you've helped over 1,000 families over the course of over 2 decades. And I know you've had a lot of successes. I can just tell you're probably a really great therapist.
Thank you.
But I would imagine that there were many difficult cases. Like you couldn't always win, right? They couldn't always win.
Oh, no. There were times where I thought I haven't helped anybody with anything. So, because by the time people come to me, mostly what's happened is they've already at that point felt so defeated, and there's so much antagonism, so that everybody's alienated from everybody, everybody's at their wits' end, and that's the starting point when people show up. And sometimes that's been the ending point. I don't want to pretend in any way that everybody comes through this process and does it well. uh, and it's timing in some ways. Of course, all of these people that I've worked with have been my teachers, and that's been great. I've done 4,000 things that didn't work, so it's a great opportunity to learn every day. And Probably literally more than 4,000 things that didn't work. But I've been taught by these families, and the children have been amazing in teaching me. I'm at a point now where most of what I'm doing is workshops, either for therapists or for families, so that I can spread the word in a greater way than just individual work, even though I hope I'll always do some individual work as long as I can.
So, have you thought about writing about your work? Because the idea about walking with a client or with a patient as opposed to working with them, I love that idea.
Yeah, I do too, and it came, over many years of realizing, well, that's I'm not working with them, and I thought, what am I doing? And I think somebody once said quite articulately that all we can really do in the end is walk each other home, and I love that phrase, and I started to get that idea, and there's such a need for all of us have this huge need to be seen for who we are and to be seen beautiful. And I think when parents get stuck on the idea that they've got to get their kids to behave a certain way, and after all, by the time they're 18, they're going to be gone. So tick, 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 we've got to get this done. If I were writing that book, it would be called Future Tense, because I see how tense families get around these things. But I have thought, to answer your question, I think I've started three different books, from a book about curiosity, which I think opens up tons of stuff if we as parents and friends can be um, deeply curious about one another. It's amazing how much we learn and how much they learn just by being heard with a deep curiosity, rather than going up into our heads and thinking, wait, I want to tell my story now. It's my turn, and we're kind of thumping our fingers, waiting for the chance to say our part. But to go more deeply and really hear another person and see them, and to see them beautiful, to see that underneath all the awful, there is some beauty. Sometimes that's a real leap of faith. I be the first to admit I have worked with people and walked with people who did not look like there was any apparent beauty, and I just had to imagine it, and eventually it shows up. And I've
Right. So, let me ask you. So, why do you think curiosity is healthy? Why, why, why is it valuable?
well, another story. There was a time when I was seeing about five 13-year-old boys, and everyone individually, and every one of them would complain about being bored, 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 bored. And at a certain point, I started thinking about it more deeply and being curious about their boredom. And I had thought that boredom was just the absence of something, and I started to realize it was the presence of distress, that it's absolutely connected to deep distress, and that these kids were in distress. They needed something to alleviate the boredom. And I realized there were two kinds of ways to do it. There was what I call distraction, spelled DYS distraction, where people come up with all sorts of awful ideas and self destructive ideas for alleviating their boredom. And I don't need to name them because we all know them. And then there's DIS, a more healthy kind of distraction. And so I started writing prescriptions. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not licensed to write prescriptions, but with these boys, I would just on a yellow lined pad write down, here's your prescription. And it would be for what I call antidistressants. And I'd learned from them what helped them alleviate their boredom. And it turned out that some of them, it was listening to music, some of them, it was something else. And that they needed to bring these things, not the things that were going to take them away in a negative to a negative place, but things that really uplifted them and brought back interest, excitement, all the affective states that are so enjoyable. So that's how I got there.
Right. So that also speaks to them feeling that they are seen, that they are recognized, because you were writing a prescription for them to get in touch with who they are.
Exactly.
Right. That's
Exactly. And
super.
and
Yeah.
what a gift it is to human beings to be seen. I know there's a book out right now by David Brooks, the opinion writer for the New York Times, who has written a number of books, but there's a book out about being seen that is just beautiful. And he just has a really clear idea about how to communicate that to people, that it's life changing. To be seen beautiful, to be seen, to really be known by another human being without judgment is the most amazing thing. And I know that a few years ago there was a book that Oprah and the psychiatrist Bruce Perry co-wrote, that had to do. I think it was called "What Happened to You." And it's, rather than asking people what's wrong with you or why are you doing this, it's what happened to you. And when you hear someone's story, really hear their story and ask the next question, it's an amazing experience to learn, oh, this is how this person became who they are. And as the person's able to share that, they are seen and heard in a way that changes them as well.
How do you feel about what you've done, about all the walking that you've done?
I would describe it as the greatest adventure of my life, to be able to have the opportunity to know other people in this way. And sometimes people will come into my office. A lot of times it'll be a single mother, just that's the image I have from my experience, who will start to tell me about themselves and their child that they're struggling with. And I'll ask a few questions and maybe make a guess about, well, I wonder if they do this as well. And within a 5 or 6 minutes, the mother is, or the parent, it can be a man as well, they start sobbing and they really cry through the rest of the session. And the reason they're crying, as they tell me, is because someone understands. And they've gone to, a lot of times I hear from people, they've been to 20 or 30 different counselors by the time they get to me, which is a huge number, but it shows the level of commitment they have. But most therapists still don't know about attachment and how it works, and about that sense from the movie Buck of children that have been through deep abuse and neglect. They're like skittish horses. It just the wrong tone. And even if you're saying the absolute most wonderful thing, the words are right, the intention is right, but the tone that comes through is either angry or judgmental or demanding. And the kids react powerfully against that. And a lot of times parents are utterly confused about why does my kid not take in the love I have, and they don't realize what they're putting out there has a layer of threat to the child which they're reacting to. So I feel very grateful to be able to do this work. I'm very grateful to be doing something that is an extension of that original commitment on my part to learn to love each person that I encounter. It feels like this is absolutely in keeping with who I want to be and who I'm becoming. And so it's great to be doing stuff that you actually get paid for sometimes.
Isn't that fantastic that all those dreams of what you wanted to do when you were 18 are coming true in the walking that you're doing? That's got to be rewarding.
It's
Yeah.
incredibly rewarding. I have been in the dark so many times that that's the painful part of being on a learning journey, is there's a lot of I don't know. Am I hurting anybody here by my lack of knowledge? I certainly made it a point to seek out. I'm sitting in my office where there's hundreds of books on attachment and on parenting and on all sorts of things that are related to that. And then I've just dug and fortunately found people that really knew way more than I. They were years and years beyond where I had walked, and so I've learned wherever I could.
And you're so humble too. So,
I don't. I think I have a working def. I didn't mean to talk over you, Jane.
No, okay. So you are the definition of humility. Is that what you're going to
I was
say, or
no.
what? What was it?
I was going to say that I have a working definition of humility because it's come up so much in my life and my work. I think it's having an accurate assessment of who we are. Period.
So you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I want to ask you about values. And when I even say the word values, what does that mean to you, and how has that shown up in your life or not?
It certainly has shown up in my life, and I think whether we use the word or not, it's there for all of us. When I think of values, used to use an instrument in part of my work where I would have people prioritize a values list. So I'm familiar with it from that kind of technical point of view. When I think of it now, I think of what do I value most? And how do I show that in the way that I live? Because it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to live it. And so I think of the things I value, and I think the thing I value most is a high quality of connection, a quality of connection that makes it possible for people, makes it enjoyable for people to give to one another. That quality of connection is what I look for as I'm interviewing and sitting with families. I want to see them shift to a high quality of connection where they enjoy giving to their children and where the children enjoy, like my nephew, enjoy making life more wonderful. So it goes in both directions. I think that another value that I have is respect. I remember putting a book down one night I was reading as my children were asleep upstairs in our house, and putting it down and just thinking, I respect my two best friends, and I would never think of raising my voice to them or demanding things, and I realized, how could I not treat my own children with at least as much respect as I treat them? The next afternoon, I was cooking dinner in the kitchen, and they were in the dining room off of the kitchen, and I told them that. And I said, if I ever raise my voice or act in some threatening, demanding way ever again, I want you to know that you can walk out the door. You can call me on it. It's an amazing thing to me that from that day on, I never raised my voice with my kids again. I never was the guy I used to be. And it took that realization that respect is a birthright, that it's not something, everybody says, well, you have to earn respect. Well, I don't believe that. I think every human being deserves respect. It doesn't mean everything goes. I think there are people that need protective restraint because they're so broken and broken in such a way that they would be dangerous to be out in the world. However, that doesn't mean we don't respect them.
I love the idea that you can grow as a parent, as a man, even I'm assuming your kids were probably teenagers then, right?
They were,
So
11 and 13, I think, if I remember right.
okay, so they were
Close
probably
enough.
pretty rambunctious too. So they
Oh
were
yeah.
they were yeah, they were like normal kids
Yep.
that get into it no
Yep.
matter what.
Sure.
I so appreciate that though, because to say it's kind of goes in that same way that I often think of, I have to remind myself to be as nice to myself as I am to others.
Absolutely.
And in the same way, to be as respectful to the people I say I care about and know that I care about them,
Sure.
be as respectful to those closest to me as those who are maybe not my immediate family members, and I'm nicer to them. That's crazy,
Yeah.
right?
Sure. I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all, right? And I've developed a consciousness, and I work with people to do this. I've developed a consciousness of needs and feelings, especially needs and the strategies that we try to use to get them met. So I wouldn't say having a brand new Lamborghini was a need of mine, but I can understand that um, feeling important and having some enjoyment, those are needs of mine. Now, it may be a tragic strategy for me to get a Lamborghini, as I would immediately go hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. But, for someone else, that might not be a bad strategy. I have no way to evaluate that. But I try to walk each day in awareness of what I'm needing and what the people around me are needing. And I found that when parents learn that their children do everything they do to try to meet a need, even if their strategy to meet it is a tragic expression of an unmet need. I remember a mother sitting with an 8-year-old daughter, adopted from an early age, and the mother was very distressed because the daughter kept hoarding sweets in her bedroom. And she'd find the next morning, no matter how many times she had scolded the daughter, there would be some wrappers of things left. And I looked at the daughter, and while I was saying this to the daughter, I was really saying it to mom at least as much. I said, so you lived for a long time without any sweetness in your life. and you want to make sure you never run out of sweetness. And I notice the mother's tears are streaming down her cheeks. It's a whole new way of thinking about what's under the behavior. This daughter was trying to meet a real need to not run out of sweetness. It was a bit of a metaphor, but to not run out of sweetness. And her strategy, not good for the teeth, maybe good for business for dentists, but not good for her teeth. And the mother knew that and understood that, but she didn't know what was underneath the behavior. And so a lot of what I do is working and teaching parents to develop a needs consciousness. I send them a needs list, and I probably should start sending them a strategies list too, because the strategies we have for meeting our needs are absolutely hysterical and tragic at the same time.
Okay, could you send those lists to me, please, too? Because I feel like I could benefit from them for sure. But I think that's a really good example with the young girl needing sweetness in her life of you seeing her
Hmm.
actually,
Hmm.
right?
Yes.
And she wasn't doing it to drive her mom crazy.
No.
She wasn't doing it to get into trouble. She wasn't doing it. She was doing it to fill a need. And
Yes.
the fact that you saw that and allowed the mother to see it in
Hmm.
a different way, that's so valuable.
I've seen that. Thank you. I've seen that when parents see their children's behavior as expressions of needs that they're trying to meet, it changes the energy so radically because now it's just what you said. They're not seeing their child as rebellious, resistant, that garbage can diagnosis of oppositional defiance disorder. It's not that. It's the child just hasn't figured out ways to meet their needs that are not hurtful.
So I want to ask you one last thing that I ask all my guests.
Sure.
And what is the one thing that no one would ever know about you unless you told them?
I've noticed this when it comes up in my conversations with people that in reality, I am the most judgmental person I've ever met. And
No, no, no,
no,
no,
no,
no.
I,
No, I
I
don't
have
buy
been
it.
known to judge rocks. I just it's so it's something I have to pay attention to moment by moment and notice in myself. I notice when my body starts to tense up, or I notice I'm having some harsh judgment about somebody or something. And I know that I need to pause and kind of take my own medicine and say, what's underneath that behavior? And we live in a world where we hear every night on the news, or every day now, 24 hours a day, news that is very judgmental and makes people sound like they're the worst things that ever happened. And I find myself falling into that and then catching myself. So I would say that my judgmentalism is probably something people are surprised about, but um, uh, to me, it's an old friend that I've learned to have a relationship with.
Yeah. Yeah, that you recognize to be true, and
Yes.
you're also wrestling with it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I know again, it's not something to, create shame and guilt in myself about. It's something to stay curious about. Where did that come from? What's going on with me?
Mhm. So is there anything else you'd like to add about who you are or what you're thinking about or what you've done?
Thanks for asking that. I think the only other thing that immediately comes to mind is I've developed this kind of a two-step process with families, especially with parents and families, but ultimately with everybody in the family. And that has to do with when things go wrong, which happens 20 times a day in all of our lives, when things go wrong, to reflect about it and say, what was going on in me when I yelled at my child, for instance, which is in a lowercase v, it's an act of violence. And especially a big person with a loud voice raising their voice. And what's going on in me? In other words, I really train people to be reflective and self-reflective. And then once they got, okay, I was tired, it had been a long day, I was hungry, I hadn't eaten well, I was ashamed because I thought I looked stupid in front of, or I was in a rush, and that's what happened. Whatever it might be, then to rehearse how they would do it differently so that there'd be a much more sweet connection that would evolve rather than the disaster that just happened. And so people come to me in between sessions. They come the next week. They've reflected on it and they tell me stories of their own self-reflection and their rehearsal and how things went differently after that. So I guess that's the one thing I hadn't touched on that I'd like to say.
That's a terrific tool. Really terrific. Okay, so you have a name for that? You're just calling it reflection,
I
or
call it
say
reflection
it
and
again.
There's probably a better name. I haven't thought about it, but up till now.
Reflection and rehearsal. I think if I think back on some of my best experiences, or rather, I should say, of an experience that I made better when I repeated it, it's because of exactly that. Because I thought about it and I practiced how I wanted it to be different, and then I was able to execute it differently.
Exactly what I'm talking about. It's a wonderful thing. And it's a gift to you and it's a gift to the other people.
Hmm. Thank you so much, Dr. Bruce. You're just a terrific guy.
Oh, thank you,
Really.
Jayne. I've enjoyed this very much. I hope this time the recording works. And
I feel it did. I'm very
good,
hopeful.
good. And what a pleasure it is for me to meet you, to meet your producer, Jake. And it's to know that you're doing what you're doing, that you've had over 80 podcasts on the subject of fostering and adoption. And what a wonderful use of your gifts in the world. Thank you so much.
Wow, that's nice. Thank you so much for saying that, because sometimes, it's hard. Like anything else. Some of the
Yes.
most important walking that you do is pretty hard.
Yep.
But then you remember, okay, no, actually, it's worth it. It's
Yeah.
really worth it.
Oh, I I see the work that you and Jake have done, and I say, oh, totally worth it, big time.
Yay!
But we forget sometimes, I know.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
thank you for having me. It's been a real gift to me.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Bruce, for taking the time to be here. I just want to throw in these anecdotes from our previous recording, which we had technical difficulties on, and then we'll close this up.
People, once they connected to the truth of who they were and really deeply accepted, embraced that, they could find their way to things that were beautiful expressions of their core selves, really flourish in the fertile soil of acceptance. And that it means accepting ourselves as well as others accepting us. But that's where we blossom. What children really can get from a family are four things: guidance, safety, nurturance, and shared enjoyment. While my focus isn't on their behavior, it's really on them developing an internal sense of trust and what I call a heart at peace rather than a heart at war. That's true for the parents as well as for their kids. I found it in a book called The Anatomy of Peace, and I have just finished reading it for the third time. It's a wonderful story that's created to help train and teach people about how to relate to themselves and everybody else in their lives with a heart at peace. How would I perhaps counsel somebody who was in kind of a war zone relationship with their children, let's say? What I would want to recognize is that this is a very hard situation. A lot of family and friends will judge you and think that you're just being too reactive because perhaps your child acts really lovingly and affectionately with them, your brother, sister, aunt, mother, father, whoever. And yet with you, when you get behind closed doors, it's a whole different story. So there's a lot of judgment that's been coming at you. And I would say, first and foremost, be gentle and kind and compassionate with yourself. That doesn't mean over and against being that way with your child, but start with you, because this is a hard road you're walking on, and it's a long road. And so if you can start by recognizing that, and then the more we apply that to ourselves, it becomes really impossible to exclude anybody from it. Because if we're deserving of compassion and gentleness and understanding, well, then so is everybody else.
Thanks again, Bruce, for your tenacity in getting this done through all the technical difficulties that we had. And I'm grateful that you made it happen. because I believe that your love and compassion for people totally comes through, and that your constant exploration and curiosity makes what you do a gift for those you walk with. So, thank you. If those of you listening would like to find the books that Bruce spoke of, you can find them on Amazon. How to Know a Person by David Brooks. That's the book he was talking about being seen. What Happened to You by Oprah Winfrey and Bruce Perry. And The Anatomy of Peace by Emery Reeves. So be sure to join us on our next episode with Glenda Wright. Glenda and her siblings were removed from her parents' care and raised by her grandma. But she and her siblings went into foster care when her grandmother passed, and she aged out without being adopted, although she was adopted through Christ by a family friend. And for the last 10 years, she's been a child welfare advocate. So join us next week for Glenda Wright. Thank you for listening, and be well. If you or someone you know is harming themselves or thinking about harming themselves, go to crisistextline.org. If you see something, say something. If you suspect a child's health or safety is jeopardized in any way by parents or anyone else, contact the Child Protective Services Agency in your county. 24-hour hotlines are staffed by trained social workers who will help you through the process, and you can do so anonymously. In California, you can call the Child Protection Hotline at 800-540-4000. So if you see something, say something. You might be saving a child's life. If you want to know more about becoming a CASA anywhere in the country, go to nationalcasagal.org. And in LA, casala.org. And if you want to know more about becoming a foster parent, check out the National Foster Parent Association at nfponline.org. There's also faithfosterfamilies.org and adoptuskids.org. There's tons of other information online as well, so you can just hunt around. We also want to thank the supremely talented Christina Apostolopoulos for her beautiful original music. You can find her music on Spotify or Instagram at Christina Aposta. And also thank you to Yukon Har for his engineering. Thanks for listening, and if you like what you hear and you find it as valuable as we do, please rate us and hit subscribe. You can also make a donation at bonusbabies.org. See you next time.